Welcome to Brain Upgrade.
Today, I want to challenge you with something incredibly simple. What if I told you that the difference between where you are today and where you could be 1 year from now isn't a secret investment, a lucky opportunity, or working 18 hours a day? What if it's just one day of changing how your brain operates? Your brain is constantly rewiring itself based on what you repeatedly do. Every habit either strengthens the neural circuits that move you towards success or reinforces the patterns that keep you exactly where you are.
The world's highest performers don't simply think differently. They've trained their brains to make better decisions, protect their attention, and invest in behaviors that compound over time.
So for the next few minutes, I want you to imagine living just one day, exactly like that. Because if you can change one day, you can change 1 week. 1 week becomes 1 month. 1 month becomes 1 year. And that's how extraordinary lives are built, not through massive changes, but through consistent biological and behavioral upgrades. Let's begin. Imagine waking up tomorrow and making just one decision differently, not to work harder, not to become instantly more disciplined, but simply to protect the first part of your day before the world begins demanding your attention. That single change has the potential to influence your focus, your energy, your emotional stability, and ultimately the quality of every decision you make for the rest of the day. Most people assume success begins with motivation, but if you look closely at how the brain operates, motivation is actually a consequence of behavior, not the cause of it. The nervous system responds to what you repeatedly do. It adapts to your environment long before it adapts to your goals. The first 60 to 90 minutes after waking represent a unique biological window. During this time, your brain transitions from the sleep state into a highly adaptable waking state. Cortisol, which is often misunderstood as a stress hormone, naturally rises during the early morning. This increase is healthy when it follows your natural waking rhythm because it promotes alertness, supports immune function, and prepares your brain for learning and focused attention. The problem is not cortisol itself. The problem is how most people interact with their environment during this critical period. One of the fastest ways to disrupt your brain's natural rhythm is to reach for your phone immediately after waking. The moment you begin scrolling through notifications, emails, social media, or news, you allow external information to determine where your attention goes. Instead of your brain selecting priorities based on your own goals, algorithms and other people's demands begin directing your cognitive resources. Attention is one of the most valuable currencies you possess. Once it is fragmented early in the day, your ability to sustain deep focus decreases significantly. Think of attention like a spotlight. Wherever that spotlight is directed repeatedly becomes stronger through a process known as neuroplasticity. Every morning, you are training your brain whether you realize it or not. If the first thing your brain experiences is constant novelty, rapid emotional shifts, and endless information, your nervous system gradually becomes conditioned to crave distraction. But if you deliberately create an environment that encourages sustained focus, your brain becomes better at concentrating over time. This isn't about personality, it's about neural adaptation. Another powerful habit involves exposing your eyes to natural outdoor light soon after waking. Light is one of the strongest signals for regulating your circadian rhythm, which governs sleep, hormone release, alertness, and metabolism. Specialized cells in the retina communicate directly with regions of the brain responsible for your internal biological clock. Morning sunlight sends a clear signal that it is time to increase alertness while also setting the timer for melatonin production later in the evening. People often search for expensive productivity tools while overlooking one of the most effective interventions available completely free of charge. Movement also plays an essential role during this early part of the day. This doesn't necessarily mean an intense workout. Even a brisk walk, mobility exercises, stretching, or a few minutes of light cardiovascular activity increases blood flow to the brain, enhances oxygen delivery, and prepares neural circuits responsible for executive function. Executive function includes planning, decision-making, emotional regulation, and resisting impulsive behavior. These are precisely the abilities that determine whether someone consistently follows through on meaningful work or becomes distracted by low-value activities. There's another important principle worth understanding. Your brain is constantly predicting what kind of day you're about to have based on the signals you provide during the first hour after waking. If those signals include rushing, reacting, consuming endless content, and checking messages every few seconds, your nervous system begins operating from a reactive state. In contrast, if the signals include quiet thinking, intentional movement, hydration, exposure to daylight, and deliberate planning, your brain interprets the environment as stable and predictable. This increases your capacity for sustained attention while reducing unnecessary cognitive load. Many highly successful individuals appear extraordinarily disciplined, but in reality, they often remove unnecessary friction before the day begins. They don't depend on making hundreds of difficult decisions. Instead, they preserve mental energy by creating predictable routines. Decision fatigue is a real biological phenomenon. Every choice consumes metabolic resources within the prefrontal cortex. By simplifying your morning, you preserve those resources for complex decisions later when they matter most. An equally valuable practice is delaying information consumption until after you've invested attention into your own priorities. Before reading someone else's opinions, writing, or requests, spend time identifying what matters most for your day. This shifts your brain from reactive attention into proactive attention. Over weeks and months, this simple habit strengthens neural pathways associated with intentional behavior rather than impulsive behavior. It's also useful to recognize that dopamine, a molecule deeply involved in motivation and pursuit, responds differently depending on how rewards are obtained. Constant digital stimulation provides frequent, unpredictable rewards that temporarily elevate dopamine, but often reduce your willingness to engage in slower, effortful tasks. Protecting your first hour from excessive digital input helps preserve the motivational systems required for meaningful work. As a result, activities that demand concentration become easier because your brain hasn't already consumed much of its reward sensitivity on trivial stimulation. The remarkable part is that none of these practices require extraordinary talent, expensive equipment, or unlimited time. They require understanding how the brain naturally functions and choosing behaviors that work with your biology instead of against it. When you consistently protect the first 90 minutes of your day, you're not simply building a morning routine. You're shaping the neural architecture that influences every conversation, every decision, every opportunity, and every habit that follows. Over time, those small biological advantages accumulate, and what once felt like discipline begins to feel like your default state. One of the biggest misconceptions about success is that it depends primarily on motivation. People often wait to feel inspired before taking action, assuming that a surge of determination will carry them through difficult work. But if you examine how the brain actually functions, you'll find that motivation is highly variable. It changes with sleep quality, stress levels, nutrition, hormones, environment, and even the time of day. Building a life around something that naturally fluctuates is unreliable. The individuals who consistently perform at a high level don't eliminate this biological variability. They simply stop depending on it. The nervous system is remarkably efficient. One of its primary goals is to conserve energy whenever possible. Every conscious decision requires activity in the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for planning, self-control, reasoning, and goal-directed behavior. While this area of the brain is incredibly powerful, it also has limited capacity. As the day progresses and more decisions accumulate, mental resources become depleted. This is one reason people often make healthier choices in the morning and struggle with discipline later in the evening. It's not necessarily a lack of character, it's the biology of cognitive fatigue. This is where systems become far more powerful than motivation. A system is simply an environment or routine that reduces the number of decisions your brain has to make. Instead of asking yourself every morning whether you should exercise, read, work on an important project, or practice a valuable skill, the decision has already been made in advance. The brain no longer wastes energy negotiating with itself. It simply follows a pattern that has been repeated enough times to become familiar. This process is supported by neural circuits involving the basal ganglia, a collection of structures deeply involved in habit formation. When a behavior is repeated consistently in a stable context, the brain gradually transfers control from effortful executive processes to more automatic ones. In practical terms, something that once required significant willpower begins requiring much less conscious effort. That's one of the greatest advantages of habits. They free cognitive resources for more complex thinking, while allowing essential behaviors to occur almost automatically. Many people approach productivity by trying to become mentally stronger every day. The more effective approach is to make productive behavior easier than unproductive behavior. The brain naturally follows the path of least resistance. If distractions are immediately available while meaningful work requires preparation, your nervous system will often choose the easier option, especially during periods of fatigue. Instead of blaming yourself, redesign the environment. For example, if your goal is to spend more time reading, placing a book on your desk makes that behavior more likely than keeping it hidden inside a drawer. If you want to exercise consistently, preparing your workout clothes the night before removes friction from the process. If you want to reduce unnecessary screen time, placing your phone in another room during focused work sessions creates just enough resistance to interrupt impulsive habits. These adjustments may appear small, but they influence behavior because the brain constantly evaluates effort versus reward. Another important principle involves reducing the number of unnecessary choices throughout the day. Every decision, regardless of how insignificant it appears, occupies mental bandwidth, Choosing what to wear, deciding when to begin work, selecting what to eat, or repeatedly changing priorities all consume cognitive energy. Highly effective individuals often standardize many routine aspects of their lives, not because they lack creativity, but because they understand that preserving attention for meaningful decisions produces better long-term outcomes. Consistency also changes how the brain predicts future behavior. The nervous system is essentially a prediction machine. Every repeated action becomes evidence for what the brain expects you to do next. If you consistently complete 1 hour of focused work every morning, your brain gradually begins anticipating that pattern. Starting becomes easier because the behavior is no longer unfamiliar. On the other hand, if your schedule changes every day and important tasks are frequently postponed, the brain receives inconsistent information, making productive behavior feel uncertain and more mentally demanding. Another reason systems outperform motivation is that they remove emotion from the decision-making process. Most people evaluate whether they should take action based on how they feel in the moment. If they feel energetic, they work. If they feel tired, stressed, or distracted, they postpone the task. The problem with this strategy is that emotions fluctuate constantly. A well-designed system doesn't ask whether you're motivated. It simply creates a predictable sequence of actions that occur regardless of temporary emotional states. This doesn't mean ignoring your biology. It means aligning important work with periods when your brain naturally performs best. For many people, cognitive performance is highest during the first several hours after waking, once alertness has fully increased. Protecting this period for high-value work allows you to leverage natural biological rhythms instead of fighting against them. Lower energy periods later in the day can then be reserved for administrative tasks, communication, or activities requiring less intense concentration.
Reward also plays a crucial role in maintaining systems. The brain strengthens behaviors that produce satisfying outcomes. However, the most effective rewards are often intrinsic rather than external. Completing a difficult task, seeing measurable progress, or recognizing personal growth activates neural pathways associated with learning and reinforcement. Instead of chasing constant external validation, successful individuals learn to associate satisfaction with the process itself. Over time, effort becomes rewarding because the brain links consistent action with meaningful progress.
Perhaps the most overlooked aspect of successful systems is their flexibility. A system isn't designed to produce perfection. It's designed to survive disruption. Missing one workout, one reading session, or one productive morning has very little impact if the system quickly returns to its normal pattern. The danger isn't occasional inconsistency. It's abandoning the structure altogether. The brain adapts to repetition over long periods, not isolated events. What ultimately shapes your behavior isn't what you do once. It's what your nervous system experiences consistently enough to recognize as your normal way of operating. One of the most common mistakes people make when thinking about success is separating financial performance from biological performance. They treat the body as something that simply carries the brain around, when in reality, every business decision, every investment, every negotiation, every creative breakthrough, and every leadership skill originates from the state of the nervous system. The quality of your thinking is inseparable from the condition of your biology. Before you optimize your calendar, your income, or your productivity tools, it is worth asking a much simpler question. Is your brain actually operating at its highest capacity? The brain is one of the most energy-demanding organs in the human body. Although it represents only a small percentage of total body weight, it consumes a remarkable amount of your daily energy. Every time you solve a complex problem, resist an impulse, plan for the future, or maintain focus during deep work, millions of neurons are communicating through electrical and chemical signals. That process depends on adequate sleep, sufficient oxygen delivery, balanced nutrition, movement, and effective recovery. Without those foundations, performance begins to decline in ways that often go unnoticed until poor decisions become repeated patterns. Sleep is perhaps the most underestimated performance tool available. Many people think of sleep as passive time, but biologically it is one of the busiest periods for the brain. During sleep, neural circuits involved in learning are strengthened, unnecessary connections are pruned, metabolic waste is cleared, and memories are reorganized into more stable forms. Emotional experiences are also processed differently during healthy sleep, allowing the brain to separate useful information from excessive emotional intensity. When sleep is consistently shortened, attention becomes fragmented, reaction time slows, emotional regulation weakens, and the ability to evaluate long-term consequences begins to decline. This becomes especially important when making financial or strategic decisions. The prefrontal cortex, which governs planning, logical reasoning, impulse control, and risk assessment, is highly sensitive to sleep quality. Even modest sleep deprivation can reduce activity in this region while increasing emotional reactivity in other parts of the brain. In practical terms, this means you're more likely to chase short-term rewards, overreact to setbacks, underestimate risks, and struggle to remain patient during uncertainty. These are precisely the kinds of decisions that can undermine long-term success. Movement is another essential component of cognitive performance. Exercise is often discussed in terms of physical appearance or cardiovascular health, but its influence on the brain is equally significant. Regular movement increases blood flow, delivering oxygen and nutrients that support neuronal function. It also stimulates the release of molecules that encourage the growth and maintenance of neural connections, making the brain more adaptable and capable of learning. Over time, consistent exercise improves attention, enhances executive function, and supports emotional resilience. Importantly, exercise doesn't have to be extreme to produce meaningful benefits. Moderate daily movement, resistance training several times each week, and regular walking all contribute to maintaining a healthy nervous system. The objective isn't exhaustion, it's creating a biological environment where the brain can perform consistently across months and years rather than only during brief periods of intense effort. Stress provides another example of how biology influences performance. Stress itself is not inherently harmful. In fact, short periods of manageable stress can sharpen attention, improve learning, and prepare the body for action. The challenge arises when stress becomes chronic and recovery never occurs. A nervous system that remains in a prolonged state of activation gradually shifts resources toward immediate survival rather than long-term planning. Concentration becomes more difficult, creativity declines, emotional reactions intensify, and decision-making becomes increasingly reactive. Learning to regulate stress doesn't mean eliminating challenges. It means developing the ability to return the nervous system to a balanced state after demanding situations. Simple behaviors such as controlled breathing, spending time outdoors, engaging in physical activity, maintaining meaningful social relationships, and protecting sufficient sleep all support this recovery process. The goal is not to avoid pressure, but to prevent pressure from becoming your permanent biological state. Nutrition also influences brain performance in ways that extend far beyond body weight. The brain depends on a continuous supply of nutrients to manufacture neurotransmitters, maintain cellular membranes, and generate energy. Large fluctuations in blood sugar can contribute to inconsistent energy levels and difficulty sustaining attention. Staying hydrated is equally important, as even mild dehydration can impair concentration, working memory, and cognitive flexibility. Many people search for complicated productivity strategies while overlooking these basic physiological requirements that directly affect how efficiently the brain operates. Energy management is often more valuable than time management. Two people may each have 8 hours available for focus work, yet produce dramatically different results because their biological states differ. One begins the day well-rested, physically active, mentally clear, and emotionally regulated. The other starts exhausted, overstimulated, dehydrated, and stressed. Although the clock provides the same amount of time, the quality of cognition within those hours is completely different. Success is determined not only by how long you work, but by the condition of the brain performing that work. There is also an important relationship between physical health and patience. Long-term wealth creation frequently requires delaying gratification, tolerating uncertainty, and making decisions that may not produce immediate rewards. These behaviors rely heavily on executive function and emotional regulation. When the nervous system is functioning optimally, maintaining patience becomes easier because the brain is less dominated by impulsive reward seeking. In contrast, chronic fatigue and persistent stress increase the desire for immediate comfort, making short-term choices feel disproportionately attractive. The individuals who consistently perform at a high level rarely view sleep, movement, recovery, and nutrition as distractions from success. They recognize them as essential components of the decision-making machinery itself. Every investment, every negotiation, every conversation, every opportunity, and every strategic plan is filtered through the biology of the brain. By strengthening that biology first, you create the conditions for clearer thinking, greater resilience, more consistent focus, and better judgment. Over time, these seemingly ordinary health practices become invisible competitive advantages because they improve not only how hard you work, but how intelligently you think when the decisions matter most. One of the defining characteristics that separates exceptional performers from everyone else is not necessarily intelligence, talent, or even the amount of effort they invest. It is the time horizon through which they make decisions. The human brain is naturally drawn toward immediate rewards because throughout evolution, responding to opportunities in the present often increased the chances of survival. Food available today was more valuable than food that might appear tomorrow. Immediate safety mattered more than future comfort. While that biological wiring once served an important purpose, it often conflicts with the demands of modern life, where the greatest rewards usually come from sustained effort over long periods. Every meaningful achievement follows a principle of accumulation. Knowledge accumulates, skills accumulate, relationships accumulate, financial investments accumulate, trust accumulates, physical fitness accumulates. None of these produce dramatic changes after a single day, but each becomes remarkably powerful through consistent repetition. The challenge is that the brain rarely perceives gradual progress as exciting. It is much more responsive to immediate feedback than delayed outcomes. Understanding this tendency allows you to work with your biology instead of becoming controlled by it. When people think about successful individuals, they often focus on visible outcomes, the thriving business, financial independence, or impressive accomplishments. What they rarely see are the thousands of ordinary decisions that produce those results. Every decision to read instead of scroll, to invest instead of spend impulsively, to exercise instead of remaining inactive, or to continue learning instead of seeking entertainment, appears insignificant in isolation. Yet the nervous system records every repeated behavior, gradually shaping identity and future expectations through those seemingly minor choices. One of the most powerful abilities the brain possesses is prediction. Your nervous system continuously estimates future outcomes based on previous experiences. When you repeatedly choose actions that prioritize long-term rewards, the brain gradually becomes more comfortable delaying immediate gratification. Neural pathways associated with self-control strengthen through repeated use, much like muscles adapt to consistent training. This is not about becoming emotionally detached. It is about teaching the brain that temporary discomfort often precedes meaningful growth. Dopamine plays a central role in this process. It is commonly misunderstood as simply the molecule of pleasure, but its primary function is to regulate motivation, pursuit, and learning. Importantly, dopamine is influenced not only by receiving rewards, but also by anticipating them. When your brain learns that consistent effort reliably leads to meaningful progress, motivation becomes more stable because the pursuit itself acquires value. In contrast, constantly chasing immediate gratification trains the brain to expect frequent rewards, making patience increasingly difficult. Consider the difference between consuming and creating. Consuming information provides instant stimulation. Creating something valuable, whether it's a business, a skill, a piece of writing, or a meaningful project, often requires extended periods where external rewards are minimal or non-existent. During those periods, many people mistakenly assume they are failing because visible progress appears slow. In reality, some of the most significant changes are occurring beneath the surface as neural circuits become more efficient and competence steadily increases. This principle is evident in learning as well. Mastery rarely arrives through dramatic breakthroughs. It develops through repeated exposure, consistent practice, correction of mistakes, and gradual refinement. The brain strengthens connections between neurons every time relevant circuits are activated. At first, these pathways require significant effort because communication between neurons is relatively inefficient. With repetition, signaling becomes faster and more reliable. Eventually, complex skills that once demanded intense concentration become remarkably fluid. The same biological principle applies to nearly every area of performance. Financial growth follows a remarkably similar pattern. Small, intelligent decisions made consistently often outperform occasional dramatic actions. The concept of compounding extends far beyond money. Reading 10 pages each day appears insignificant until months become years. Exercising regularly may produce subtle improvements initially, but those improvements compound into greater health, energy, and resilience. Investing a small amount consistently often produces greater long-term benefits than waiting for the perfect opportunity. The brain, however, tends to underestimate exponential growth because it naturally thinks in linear patterns. Another important aspect of long-term thinking involves emotional regulation. Immediate emotions frequently encourage decisions that conflict with future goals. Fear encourages avoidance. Frustration encourages quitting. Excitement encourages impulsive risk-taking. The prefrontal cortex serves an essential role by evaluating whether present emotions align with long-term objectives. Strengthening this capacity requires repeatedly pausing before reacting, allowing logical evaluation to influence behavior instead of allowing temporary emotional states to dictate important decisions. There is also tremendous value in adopting a broader perspective when evaluating progress. Many people judge success based on daily outcomes. They become discouraged after a single unproductive afternoon or an unsuccessful week. The brain, however, adapts over much longer periods. Neuroplastic changes occur through repeated exposure across weeks, months, and years. Missing one workout has almost no measurable impact. Reading one exceptional book will not instantly transform your life. Likewise, one poor financial decision rarely determines your future. What matters is the overall trajectory created by repeated patterns. This perspective reduces unnecessary emotional volatility. Instead of asking whether today was perfect, ask whether today's actions moved you slightly closer to the person you intend to become. That shift changes how the nervous system interprets setbacks. Temporary failures become information rather than evidence of inadequacy. Mistakes become opportunities for refinement instead of reasons to abandon meaningful goals. This mindset supports resilience because the focus remains on long-term adaptation rather than immediate validation.
Perhaps the greatest advantage of thinking in years instead of days is that it changes the criteria by which decisions are made. Rather than asking, what feels good right now, the question becomes, what will my future self appreciate having done consistently? That simple shift activates a different pattern of thinking. It encourages patience over urgency, investment over consumption, discipline over impulse, and sustained progress over short-lived excitement. Over time, those choices accumulate in ways that are often invisible from one day to the next, but become unmistakable when viewed across months and years. The remarkable reality is that extraordinary outcomes are very often the product of ordinary actions repeated long enough for biology, behavior, and time to work together in your favor.
Your future isn't determined by one extraordinary decision. It's determined by the ordinary decisions you repeat every single day. Your brain is adapting right now. Every action you take is teaching your nervous system what to become. The question is simple. Are you training your brain for distraction or for excellence? Don't wait for the perfect moment. Don't wait until you feel motivated. Start with one day. Protect your attention. Protect your health. Build systems instead of depending on willpower. Think in years instead of hours. Because the habits you practice today become the identity you live tomorrow. If you found value in this video, subscribe to Brain Upgrade because every week we explore the science of building a sharper mind, stronger habits, and a better life. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.